Hi, everybody. I know people are still coming in, but we'll get started. My name is Dr. Shayna Weiss. I am the Associate Director of the Schusterman Center for Israel Studies, and I am thrilled to welcome you to our second part of a three-part series about Aleph Dalet Gordon, A.D. Gordon. Today is titled A Religion of Labor, A.D. Gordon and the Sacred Secular. Before I introduce our panelists, I want to start with a bit of housekeeping. First of all, I want to mention that we have live captioning. You can turn it off if you'd like. The option to do so is at the bottom of your screens where it says live transcript. During the course of our session, please send all your questions to the chat and our Q&A moderator will collect them. I want to offer a few thank yous as well. Firstly, I want to thank the Tauber Institute at Brandeis for the study of European Jewry for their support. I want to thank our panelists, and of course, I want to thank our staff at the Schusterman Center, particularly Anna and Risa, for making sure that this goes smoothly today. I am going to briefly introduce our panelists, who all have many, many accomplishments. Firstly, I want to introduce Lilach Rosenberg-Friedman. She is the Associate Professor and Chair of the Land of Israel Studies and Archaeology Department at Bar-Ilan University in Israel. She is a social historian who looks at Israel in the modern period with an emphasis on women, gender, and family. Yossi Turner is the Professor of Jewish Thought at the Schechter Institute for Jewish Studies in Jerusalem. He is the author of A Quest for Life, a study in Aharon David Gordon's philosophy, which came out in 2020 by Academic Studies Press, a very much needed biography, and I am excited to hear some of those insights. And finally, our very own Yair Tzuri. He is a doctoral student in Near Eastern and Judaic Studies and a Schusterman Scholar at the Schusterman Center for Israel Studies at Brandeis University. Thank you, everyone. So I want to start with the title, right? Many associate Gordon and his philosophy with the idea of religion of labor. And although he himself was not always such a fan of the term, how do you understand this term? And how is it similar to this conquest that many of us know of this idea, of conquest of labor, which prioritized Jewish workers in creating a new society? And how did these ideas of a religion of labor squared with the lived reality in the Yishuv in Jewish pre-state Palestine? And all my questions, I will start with a particular person and then others feel free to chime in. So with this, Yossi, please, let's start with you. Yossi, you're muted.
Here we go. I knew I had to. Right. Okay. First off, I want to make the comment that my book on A.D. Gordon, Quest for Life, is not a biography, but it's rather an analysis or a philosophical analysis of his thought, of course, using historical and biographical background. And this is also relevant to the way I'm going to answer your question, if you'll permit me. What I'd like to do is talk about the concept of the ethos of labor that was characteristic of the second Aliyah community, and particularly about the religious, or to use Gordon's term, cosmic dimensions, the cosmic dimensions of the way in which Gordon himself understood the second Aliyah ethos of labor. At this point, I would prefer not to talk about the term religion of labor, which indeed he didn't like at all, because that would require a discussion following what I have to say. And here I'll be giving the general background for that further discussion. So as I said, I want to begin with a few words on the importance of labor in the second Aliyah. And here we need to recall the pioneers' assessments, right? The members of the second Aliyah pioneer communities' assessment of what they considered to be the unhealthy life of the Jewish people in exile. For too long, they believed, the Jewish people lived in books, in holy books, with little or no investment in the material aspects of life necessary for survival on the physical plane, leaving such mundane matters to the non-Jewish world that surrounded them. And in this context, physical labor, the working of the land, the labor that went into building a new community was seen as a revolution in Jewish life, necessary in order to make the Jewish people healthy again. The pioneers' intention was to bring about a revolution in Jewish life wherein Jews would once again become responsible for their own existence by producing their own life needs through their own labor. And now the central question is, how did Aaron David Gordon specifically understand this ethos of labor? Well, on one level, he agreed entirely with this practical or functional understanding of labor as a vehicle for the rejuvenation of the Jewish people, beginning with the individuals comprising the pioneer community of the second Aliyah. But Gordon's thinking on the matter went much deeper, because for him, labor had not only practical or functional significance, but was in addition that activity which in healthy societies joins the human being to the cosmos from which he or she was created. And it's only really in this context that we can speak about the religious or cosmic dimensions of Gordon's thought. Put succinctly, we can say that Gordon adopted but also changed the statement that appears in the morning prayers of traditional Judaism to the effect that God renews the work of creation day in and day out. In Gordon's view, God and nature, God and the infinite natural cosmos are one and the same, so that for him, it is not so much the traditional transcendent God that renews creation every day and always, but rather it is nature itself, nature as the dynamic of creation that renews itself and gives birth to itself at every moment of every day. And labor, in this context, is the act through which human beings join themselves to the infinite self-creation of the cosmos. Therefore, according to Gordon, labor was not only necessary in order to pursue and develop a healthy life, it was also to be the cosmic source of a national Jewish renaissance that he presumed to be the ultimate goal of Zionism. It's as if we were to say that the idea that one can worship God through the study of holy books is a mistake, and that a true religiosity can only come from the actual experience of being tied to the infinite self-creation of the cosmos, as happens.
Yossi, thank you so much. I know you have a lot to say. I'm going to stop you for a second because I want to make sure that we have a chance to get to all our questions. And again, please feel free to weigh in later as well. So Lilach or Yair, again, with any question, feel free to weigh in. Yair, I wanted to see if you had anything else you wanted to add to this idea of labor and mysticism, especially maybe as it played out to the lived reality of this time period, which Gordon is thinking and writing. Yair, you're also muted.
Sorry, hi. Well, first of all, this is such a great opportunity, and thank you so much for having me, and it's a pleasure to be here with everyone. Right, so I mean, I'm not sure that it would be completely accurate to say that Gordon rejected Jewish observance, but rather that he, as Yossi mentioned, right, that he seriously criticized religious institution and what it does to the actual religious experience, or what Gordon referred to as religious feeling or impulse. Gordon, like many others in his generation, did extensive usage in mystical terminology, mainly through the Hasidic tradition. And there's an argument whether or not Gordon actually understood the original or true meaning of these mystical terms, or that he actually used them simply because of the fact that he didn't have enough philosophical words or terms in Hebrew. Gordon's usage in mystical terminology is also connected with defining Gordon's thought as secular or religious, which I'm sure that we'll talk about further on. I think that Gordon's usage of mystical terminology, I don't know if we wanna get into that now or not, right? Right. So Gordon's usage of mystical or Hasidic terminology allows him, I think, to capture some sort of a quality that maintains the theological tension that he wishes to have in his thought. So it is clear to Gordon that the experience that he's referring to is ineffable, but it involves tremendous amount of deep knowledge, of extensive connection with being, with nature, with the cosmos. But I actually think that the main usage that Gordon does in mystical terminology is to emphasize the primary conflict or contradiction of human existence. And I just want to say a word about this because I think it's crucial. So Gordon emphasizes the contradiction between man being this creature of intellect or rational creature, which is a thing that makes him who and what he is. But this quality stands in direct contradiction with the fact that it alienates man from nature, because it analyzes it and it's always in retrospective. It's never completely present. So it turns out that this quality, this embedded quality of the individual being a rational person, alienates him from nature. And this contradiction is something that, even though Gordon does see this harmonic horizon of completion or of wholeness or what have you, this contradiction is something that is impossible to completely overcome. And I think this is exactly why he needs these mystical terms, because the movement that the mystical terminology allows him to do is a movement that imagines harmony, it imagines balance, it imagines completion, but actually lives the tension, the drama between the dichotomous pulses, right? So we have the feminine quality and the masculine quality, and in mystical terminology. And besides, the mystical language in and of itself relates to the problem that Gordon himself raises, right? To talk about the thing that is impossible to talk about, right? How do you talk about the divine in mystical terms? This is a fundamental problem that mystical the mystic tradition deals with. And Gordon talks about that too, right? There's, in last week's panel, Gordon's famous speech, Am Adam, right, that he gave in 1920. The first few lines, he says that I'm here to talk about something that is far greater than words, right? It's not that I have a problem to talk about these kind of things, but this thing, right, that I'm about to talk about is far greater to express in words. But I think just one final comment. I think that it is crucial to understand that Gordon, as Yossi mentioned, right? Gordon is not a traditional Kabbalist. There's no drama in upper worlds. There's no, the transcendence element collapses into the immanent quality of, the drama between the individual and nature. So in this way, he's definitely not like a traditional Kabbalist, if you will.
So for the next thing to think about, we've talked about this idea of secular and religious. How are they similar? How are they different? A lot of the writing on Gordon calls him a post-secular theologian, right? What that might mean is not always entirely clear, but I saw this clip today on the Israeli news. I quickly put subtitles on it because I want to show it to all of you, because I thought it so perfectly encapsulated some of the discussions Gordon was trying to have and the resonance that it has in contemporary Israeli society. So what I want to do is I want to show the clip. It's about a minute long, and then I want to hear your reactions and this relationship between this idea of a post-secular and the resonance it has in contemporary Israeli culture. So the interview, this was on the Israeli news this morning, I think, is between Yair, who is a journalist. You'll see he is Haredi, and Merav Michaeli, who is the head of the Labor Party, and a very, very interesting woman and thinker in her own right. And at the end of the interview, this is just context, you will see he asks her, can I ask a different question, not related to politics? So I'm going to share my screen and play it, and then I want to hear what you all think. 1 second. And there will be subtitles on the bottom.
אפשר שאלה שבכלל לא קשורה לפוליטיקה? מצוי, מאמינה באלוהים? לא באמת, זאת אומרת, אני לא כופרת בקיומו של אלוהים, או לא, אין לי כל כך יחסים עם הדבר הזה, אתה מבין? מבחינתי, יכול להיות שיש אלוהים, יכול להיות שאין, אני לא אדם דתי באופן הזה. לא שאלתי אם אתה אדם דתי, שאלתי אם אתה מאמין. אני מאמינה, אבל לא באלוהים. אלא אני מאמינה כאילו, זאת שאלה טובה במה אני מאמינה. נראה לי שזאת אולי השאלה הכי חשובה ברעיון הזה, במה את מאמינה. אני באמת מאמינה שבסוף, אני מאמינה שיש יצר האדם טוב מנעוריו ומנעוריה. ואני יודעת שהמבנה הוא מה שגורם לנו להוציא מעצמנו את הטוב או את הלא טוב. ואני מאמינה שאפשר לגרום לאנשים להיות יותר טובים ושיהיה להם יותר טוב לסביבה שלהם. ולכן שצריך לעשות כל מאמץ כדי שזה יקרה. באמת בזה אני מאמינה.
So I apologize. I did those captions quickly this morning, so I apologize if there are any slight mistakes. Lilach, I saw you smiling when you saw that.
Well, I'm a historian, so right. Speaking about contemporary Israelis, my idea is like everyone else. But I can add briefly that Gordon was the head of his time, and I suppose his approach would have found a place in contemporary Israeli society, which is much more diverse in terms of beliefs, definitions of religion and traditions. These have expanded and diversified. You, Shayna, spoke about Yair Sherki, and you declared that he is Haredi, but I'm not sure that we can put him in this exactly box. So the box, we have many boxes nowadays, but if we are dealing with the period that Gordon was part, I think that Yair spoke about the contradiction, and the contradictions is the key word here. And I found a huge connection between Gordon and the religious Zionism, the religious pioneers who immigrated to Palestine actually after Gordon died in the 20s of the 20th century, and their organization, Hapoel HaMizrahi, was only founded in 1922. But the religious pioneers and Gordon nevertheless shared several common perspectives, and we can find also today the religious kibbutz movement quoting Gordon nowadays in the 21st century in order to explain its thought and worldview. So it's very interesting, and I think that retrospectively, because they didn't meet physically, Gordon and the religious pioneers, but I can point a number of connections between them. Gordon is frequently referred to as a secular tzaddik, who propagated the religious of labor. And during his lifetime, religion and pioneering were regarded as dichotomous, and religious pioneering was also regarded as an oxymoron in the working circles of the 20s onwards, and even earlier. A person was either a pioneer or religiously observant. And pioneership was thought to be the negation of exile and its tradition-bound lifestyle, while the religious pioneers sought to participate in the pioneering revolution. They refused to renounce tradition despite the critic of the old world, like Gordon. The goal was to integrate the old and the new, and I think it's similar to Gordon's worldview. And Gordon similarly also straddled two worlds, being emotionally loyal to both the old exilic Judaism and the new secular revolutionary pioneer movement. And while he regarded rebellion against the old Jewish world as a tragic mistake, he understood it and identified with some of the criticism leveled against it. In his view, Judaism lost its vitality and needed to rejuvenate itself in order to survive. And the religious pioneers who identified with the secular revolution but found it difficult to abandon Jewish tradition, considered themselves to be engaged in a holy revolt. The rebellion was holy. And despite only emerging some years after Gordon's death, this movement may well have been taken inspiration from his view on the place of religion in nascent nation states. And Gordon's attitude towards religion and halacha is complex. He was observant in his youth, but he kept some of the traditional commands as he grew up. And he regarded pioneering as a true religious act. And in this respect, he shared the belief that individual and national renewal rests on religious sense with the religious pioneers. And holding himself responsible for reconnecting the present generation with their ancestor, he devoted himself to healing the cultural rift between revolutionaries and the traditional Jewish community. And in this sense, he preceded religious Zionism, which perceived itself as a bridge between secular Zionism and religion. And Gordon's worldview was based on a variety of sources. He studied in traditional Bet Midrash, but he also acquired a general education, and he showed an interest in science and nature. And he sought to combine traditional learning with modern science from an early age. And it was like the religious pioneers and the religious Zionism later that wish to integrate religious life with nationalism and modernization and modernism and general education. And it was-
Lilac, I want to stop you there because I want to make sure again that we just have all a chance.
Okay, maybe just a short phrase because I think it's important. It was not easy to implement this approach in practice because we know that Gordon, after his marriage, moved in with his wife's parents, where he made acquaintance with a group of Hasidim, and they saw him as apikores. And on the other hand, the pioneering world of the second wave of immigration failed to understand his religious lifestyle. And it was the same reality of the religious pioneers. The ultra-Orthodox accused them of being religious light, while the secular pioneers thought that they were more religious than revolutionary. So how you combine these two worlds that contradicted each other, Gordon and I think that religious Zionism till today are struggling to find out. Thank you.
I wanted to give a chance for Yair or Yossi or both of you to react to that video and to think about how, to me, maybe it's because Gordon's on my mind, Michaeli's answer was so Gordonian in a sense. And just wanted to see what you all think. Yossi, yeah.
Yeah, I have to disagree. I'm sorry. I think that Meirav Michaeli and what she said there is worlds apart from Gordon. She made a statement that I think is a very, maybe even a good statement with a lot of value, but it was a rather simplistic statement that can be made by any modern humanist without any sense of religiosity on the one hand, or obligation to an ethos of labor, or any other deeply anchored worldview. I mean, basically what she said was, and I actually agree with this, right? That she believes, well, actually, I'm not sure I agree with this. And I'm convinced that Gordon would not have agreed with it. I'm ambivalent as to whether human beings are good by their nature or not. It's clear to me that Gordon would have answered that question, again, in a very deep way. He would have said that what makes human beings, living human beings, is the power of life that comes from the infinite self-creation of the cosmos. And to the extent that human beings develop their morals and their relationships with each other through the understanding that that's a common denominator of in his words, of all of the entire cosmos and all of creation, then human beings will be good to each other. To the extent that they use their cognitive faculties to look after their own selfish interests and divorce themselves from the common source of life to all, then they'll act badly with each other. Again, both in terms of the direction and in terms of the depth, I think that what Meravi Michaeli had to say here is very, very, the only thing I guess I could say that it may have in common with Gordon is that Meravi Michaeli is the head of the Labor Party in Israel. But in terms of the substance, it's very, very far away.
Thank you. Yair, do you want to say anything or?
Yeah, I don't know, just a quick anecdote or something. Gordon, and I think Lilach also mentioned it. Gordon was blamed or accused, if you could say that, right, for his thought to be too religious, too theological, or too philosophical, right? Depends on the different segments, people who criticized him or misunderstood him or whatever. I think Merav Michaeli's answer here to the question, do you believe in God, is a completely different answer, is an answer to a completely different question, right? The term belief, right, and the immediate comparison with it, to notions of the divine or whatever, right? That's not really what she was asked, and I think initially she answered the question, what do you believe that is good? What do you believe about people, about individuals, and whatever? It's not about a question of the divine. And I think what Yossi said of how Gordon would relate to the connection between the individual and what Gordon viewed as the divine, which is the cosmos, which is nature, would be a completely different answer.
Thank you. And I'm glad you mentioned nature, because that's one of our questions that I wanted for us to talk about. And I know we're going to focus a lot on nature, especially the ecological aspect next week, but I want to return to something I think we've all mentioned, and that's the role of nature in Gordon's religious or mystical thought, right? How does he think of nature? Is it similar to, let's say, sort of standard European late 19th, early 20th century idea of nature? Is it different? And what role, really focusing on that, what role it has, right? Is it something to be observed? Is it something to be worked? How does that play out in his thought? So Yossi, I think that one is for you. You're still muted.
I think pretty much I already said what I have to say about that. Nature for Gordon is the dynamic of creation.
Okay.
And nature plays the central aspect of Gordon's thought, and what joins his thought to the endeavor of the second Aliyah is the obligation that he felt that stands before human beings to build a good and healthy life by joining themselves to the creative forces of nature. And then, of course, what I didn't say, but is also true, is that for Gordon, it's through this understanding of human beings as being an aspect of nature, and of human beings whose fundamental experience, even especially when they're not aware of it, is that of being a part of nature, is also what gives rise to ethics, to art, to and of course to religious worship as well. But it all comes down to that fundamental experience of the human being experiencing him or herself as an aspect of the self-creation of the cosmos.
And so would you say that that's a personal process, a national process, both?
It's a cosmic process. For him, the personal, the familial, the family, the community, and the people, which in his time was still almost always an ethnic people, all of these things, including ethics, philosophy, all of these things, those are already reflections upon, but all of these things have no value or depth for him unless they're a part of the infinite self-generation or self-creation of the cosmos. In terms of the Jewish people, that's why he's so became so deeply tied in to that ethos of labor. It was a way of breaking the contraction of human experience in the Jewish community of exile and making it a more expanded cosmic experience as he thought all healthy human beings needed to live.
Thank you. So, Yair or Lilach, is there anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, sure. I wanted to add something about the I guess the romantic image
Yes.
granted to Gordon in his in his approach or relation to nature. So the romanticist image that was granted to Gordon, which has, I guess, a certain element of truth to it, was used mainly by those who tried to explain Jewish nationalism as an organic phenomenon.
1 second. For those of us in the audience who may not know what this romantic image, could you just explain what it was to make sure that we're all familiar with it?
Yeah, so I guess the romanticist movement, right, is a movement that negated in a way the rational, I guess, trajectory that modernity was leading to, and mainly talked a lot about the return to the natural habitat of individuals and all the ramifications it had for humanism and so on and so forth. So and Gordon's approach as a romantic approach, or his I guess perception of nature that was viewed as a romantic approach, connected or made the connection between nature and nationalism, which was also a result of the romantic movement in a way, or the romantic line of thought. So whoever appreciated this trajectory that Gordon was making, talked about passion, and talked about Jewish normalization that Yossi mentioned earlier on, right? The Jewish people returning to nature, returning to the forces of to vitality and so on and so forth. And those who appreciated less the romantic trajectory saw it as a way of almost like proto-fascism, even, right? To say that the organic return, or the organic relation from the people to the land it goes along this line. But I still think that Gordon's usage in the term nature in the national context does create a certain ethics that in a way resembles, just in a way resembles the biblical connection between the people and the land, a connection that does not have ownership, does not have exploitation of land or the people laboring in that land, and that labor in itself is a connection to being in an unexploiting manner, and that this labor, I guess, requires a certain moral behavior. And Gordon was very, very, very careful with any political exploitation of the national revival and the return of the Jewish people to Eretz Israel, and insisted to maintain this unachievable end. And I guess this is, I think, in my opinion, this is the theological element of Gordon's notion of labor, right? An unachievable end, or like a destination that is impossible to achieve. And through that, he connected between national revival and nature as two destinations which require constant renewal.
Thank you. I want to go back to this discussion of self-fashioning, and perhaps we can discuss whether it's self-fashioning or fashioning by others. But there's this idea of Gordon. One of his nicknames was the old man, right? Because he was much older than a lot of the people in the second Aliyah with whom he was working or sort of inspiring. There is also discussion of how his relationship with his daughter Yael and his family infected some of his thinking. And so I just want to ask about that. How does his self-fashioning, his maybe later fashioning, and especially his relationship with his family influence Gordon and how we think about that? And for that, I want to turn to Lilach first.
Okay, so Gordon was raised as an only child, and he was very close to his mother, Dvorah. She was very wise, and many people came to speak with her and to consulted with her on various subjects. And the relationship between him and his mother can be assumed to have a great effect upon him and his views regarding women and women capacities. And we know very little about his wife, Fagel. He was only 15 when they were engaged, but we know a lot about his daughter, Yael. And Yael became one of the important women in the female worker movement in Palestine. And Gordon taught her areas of subject, and he helped her to establish a girls' school. And by the way, Einat Ramon records an amusing anecdote in this regard. When he was unemployed and he decided to immigrate, and he couldn't decide between several destinations, and it was his wife who came down firmly on the side of Eretz Israel. So it appears to debunk the myth of the old pioneer who abandoned everything to immigrate from ideology, etc. It was his wife. But Yael, if we can see, yes, Yael wrote a lot, and her writings reflect her father's worldview. She is using the phrase, for example, a woman person. Yeah, I'm a woman person. And we can see the influence of her father on her. Gordon had close ties with female pioneers from the second Aliyah, and he was old, as you said, Shayna, and the old people and the women were together. Yes, and they worked together in the vegetable garden, and he supported the women's struggle. And we're familiar with his correspondence with Rachel המשוררת, Rachel the poet, and Gordon revealed to her some of his inner feelings and his disappointment with human nature and wish to be alone, and his regard for her as a talented woman whose potential she should cultivate. And this was his approach to women as a whole. Gordon's attitude towards women and gender equality was very, very complex. Being bound up with his notion of the family, he argued that motherhood forms the essence of women. And his view of women and their principal role as mothers rests on his beliefs that family unit underlies all human systems and the nation being a large family. And women are giving birth to the next generation, and women are responsible for raising children and families according to the new nation's values. And Gordon also regarded familism as a lifeline that would save the modern Jew from alienation and detachment. And the idea of rectifying humanity should be led, therefore, and advanced by women because of their motherhood characteristics, if there is such a thing. And he argued that motherhood being the model par excellence for ethical behavior, that women embody familial rather than alienated patterns. However, this is, I must add, of course, an idealization of the family, which, as we all know, can suffer from violence, female discrimination, etc. But also the complexity or the contradiction point of view in this regard of Gordon's, because while he greatly admired motherhood on ethical grounds, his attitude constricts women to this single role. So Gordon's attitude to gender equality was similarly complex. In his writing, he relates to men and women as one, advocating that women should hold the same status as men in public sphere. At the same time, however, he argued that there must be a recognition of the distinctiveness and uniqueness of each and every individual. He thus rejected mechanical egalitarianism. He contended that equality must be grounded on the biological and functional difference between the genders. So this view is consistent with 21st feminist approaches, with Merav Michaeli probably, but Gordon again was ahead of his time in this respect. The pioneers of his period hoped for a different form of equality. The pioneer ethos being essentially male, women could only gain equality if they prove themselves to be as capable as men. and he was against it. Gordon criticized the pioneer quality ethos according to which women should live like a man, and he regarded the demand of women for equal rights and obligation as a form of self-annihilation in the face of the male world. He argued that women subordinated themselves to the male point of view, and in his eyes, this female equality diminished the status of women. And faced with this dilemma, he hoped that the more women took part in the male world, the more they would understand that their path to self-realization differed. And it is unclear whether he believed that the moment women reached this conclusion, they would voluntarily withdraw from public life. He exposes a double standards here, maybe like Benjamin Zev Herzl in Untitled, wherein he portrayed women as preferring to remain at home and not bothering themselves with public life, despite the egalitarianism of the new society. So we don't know if Gordon wished it.
Right.
Yeah.
But thank you. I just want to say, for my American ears, it sounds like Republican motherhood, right? Which I'm sure a lot of people are familiar with. Yeah. And I want to just say one thing, and then I want to hear what you want to say. It's really interesting because when the second Aliyah is taught, it's often taught as the pioneers wanted to break the family model, right? There's all these stories of the young men, and they didn't have women, and all those sort of things. And I think what you're doing is showing that both Gordon one thought differently, and also the reality, of course, what was happening in these so was also different as well. Yair.
Yeah, there's an anecdote which I'm not sure if it's true, like completely accurate or not. Maybe those of you, the rest of the people here in the panel could correct me or not. So there's this anecdote that when they were still in Europe, Yael, Gordon's daughter, wanted to marry a certain person, and Gordon was completely against the shidduch. He was against the
match.
The match, their relationships, and Yael Gordon does talk a lot about her father as as this educational character who completely supported or pushed her as a woman, as a girl already, right? To study exactly the same as her brother. But her response to Gordon's refusal to the matching was that she refused to get married ever again, and she remained unmarried for the rest of her life.
And this is I read about it also, and I'm not sure if it was really her decision or her reality, but but it totally against father perception of the family, the importance of the family, the importance of motherhood, and he called the pioneers to marry and have children. And just a small short quote, he told them life should be life, not an ideal, or work in the service of an ideal. And this is impossible without a family. And you should live a life, and the family is the chain linking the individual to the society, and the family is the foundation upon which society is built, and people cannot exist without the family unit. But his own daughter didn't have a family of her own, and maybe again it was because of this contradiction, these double messages that he spoke of all the time. Maybe she was confused. I'm just
Yossi, yeah.
Yeah, I think that it's important. The fact that there apparently are a contradictory emphases and attitudes within Gordon. I think one thing needs to be said, that Gordon was a real live human being before he was an icon or even a philosopher or a thinker. And people have contradictory attitudes. When we talk about both his understanding of the place of women in society and his understanding of family, It's all related, and I think that Lilach mentioned this, it's all related to his understanding of the term self-realization, and is also connected with the statement he made. By the way, I want to suggest to anybody, if you want to choose, I mean, there are other articles too, but one of Gordon's articles, which is very telling, it brings together a lot of different aspects of his thinking. I suggest the article, actually the letter he wrote to the founders of the first Moshav, Nahalal, where he actually makes the statement that in the society that's going to be constructed, we have to make sure that the society is more influenced by family, by the structure of family relations, rather than have family relations be remodeled according to that of society. And the reason, and this has to do with his understanding of the role of men and women as well, the reason the family is paramount for him, again, I don't want to harp on this so much, but it just is the way that Gordon thought. The family is a society that's still a natural phenomenon, in the sense that it's constructed in an organic character of relations. The relationship between the individual and the group in the family resonates the relationship between a cell and an organism in nature. All right, the relationship between the tension between the individual and the group is such that the group is comprised of many different individuals. Every individual is an individual, and thus the individual eventually affects the personality of the group, just as the personality of the group affects the personality of every single individual. What this means for Gordon in regard to every individual and every man and every woman is that ultimately social justice for him is the achievement, is the creation of equal conditions for the possibility of self-realization on the part of every single individual, and that'll make a healthy society. Just as every individual has his own personality or her own personality and own self, so it is true, he also believed that there was a difference between men and women on all different levels, both the tension, the common denominator, and the distinctions come into play. And therefore, maybe we shouldn't so much look for an absolutely consistent ideological worldview on Gordon's part in these matters.
Thank you, right? It's a good reminder, right? These people whose words we read lived real lives with real thoughts, and to take that into account. I want to think about sort of Gordon, or say, let me back up a second. In the time that we have left before we go to questions, I want to think about other audiences which Gordon doesn't really interact with, as far as I know. And again, I'm happy to be corrected. And to think about relationships that Gordon has with these audiences. And the first one is this question of Ashkenaziness or Europeanness, right? Gordon is firmly coming from a European Ashkenazi tradition. And, you know, does he, first of all, does he comment at all on, I don't know if we want to call them Mizrahi Jews quite yet, but let's say Yemenite worker colonies going on in the land of Israel at the time, etc. And then thinking more expansively, are there any other Mizrahi thinkers who speak to similar issues or that he interacted with, either at the time or who later on commented on his work? I've been thinking a lot about the notion of traditionalism, especially, let's say, as Yaakov Yadgar talks about it. Is that something that is perhaps in dialogue with Gordon? Yossi, I think I had you first on this, but anyone should feel free to comment.
I'm sorry, but I'm just too ignorant in this area, and I don't really feel as though I have much to say. The only thing I can only say that I'm also hard pressed to think of other Western or Ashkenazi thinkers who are similar to Gordon. I think Gordon, in a large extent, is sui generis. He put together his system in a very unique situation, and that was the situation of the second Aliyah. in his time. What he was able, the kind of thoughts and possibilities he was able to put together there were not really existent in any potential form in the centers of Western civilization, and I imagine not among Eastern Jewry as well, because the realities, the challenges were just so different. And then from what he was confronting. And also he had a very specific meeting of different kinds of sources, Western philosophy, Kabbalah, Hasidut, and so on and so forth. And so more than that, I'm not enough of a baki. I don't know enough of many thinkers to say who he might be compared with, but my general tendency is to say in many things that Gordon is really sui generis, even of course their comparisons can be made.
Does he ever mention non-Ashkenazi workers or refer to different kinds of people, like the Yemenite worker colonies, for example, that were there at the time?
I remember reading someplace that he did have a voice during the time that there was a very bad attitude and behavior toward the Yemenite workers in the area of the Kinneret, and that he reproved, right? It's criticized that, but I don't remember seeing much information on that would help with this kind of question.
Okay, thank you. So, Lilach or Yair, is there anything you'd want to add?
Not for me, there is this subject.
Okay. Okay. For our next conference, we'll think about that. And that, and then my next question is similar, and that's, sort of the question of Arab workers or Palestinian workers, right? We know from the 1890s, maybe even a bit earlier, that thinkers on the ground in Palestine are already thinking about the role of the Arab worker, the fellahin, the Palestinian peasant, etc. How does Gordon relate to the Palestinian population, and specifically the land-working Palestinian population, the fellahin, some of who were displaced by these kibbutzot? Right. Yair, do you have a?
Yeah, sure. Here too, I don't know. I'm sorry to disappoint, but here too, I think Gordon also answers to the notion of some sort of like an inner conflict within his thought, because on the one hand, Gordon, could be considered as this, ultimate humanist that sees, that would say that that a right over a land is being bought, so to speak, through life and through labor. And he would say, and he did say that Arabs were living in Palestine and they work there and so on and so forth. But on the other hand, he would say that the historical right that the Jews have over the land is far greater than the Arabs living here. So there is this tension here, right? He does say that no matter what happens, the relations between the Jews and the Arabs should be built on mutual trust and respect and whatever. But for him, when he describes the land before the different waves of immigration to Palestine, he says that the land was barren, was empty almost. And by that he obviously ignores the Arab presence in Palestine. So again, there's like a complex relations to this matter.
Yossi, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I'm going to have to disagree with Yair.
Great.
Because number one of the things that's actually almost jumps out at you when you read what Gordon wrote on these things is a statement where he says that the Jewish ties to the land through the Bible and through the Jewish heritage, it had nothing to the Jewish rights to the land of Israel except the right to compete with others over the land, meaning competing with the Arabs over the land. And implicit in his words and hinted at by other things he says is that he understands that from the Arab point of the Palestinian Arab point of view, they have as much right to the land as the Jews do historically. He certainly didn't agree that the Arabs have more of a historical right to the land than the Jews did, but he was very careful to limit the strength of the Jewish historical right to the land. It only gives us the right to compete, nothing more. And then what Yair said is absolutely true. He said, whosever land this is going to be in the end is going to be a result of whoever works the land. He says explicitly, in the areas that the Jews are already working the land, that land is already Jewish land. Where the Arabs are working the land, that land is already Arab land. And the question that arises is only whether and to what extent Arabs and Jews are going to develop their ethos of labor and work in the areas of the land that are not yet developed. And here I think it's very, very important to recall that Gordon was very much aware of a serious damage, evil that was done to the Arabs that were living in the area that the Moshav of Nahalal was created in, because this is an area in which the Jews bought the land from an absentee landlord. And as a result, half of the population living in the entire area lost its livelihood. Gordon, in that article I mentioned before about the founding of Nahalal, therefore said to them, the relationship to those not living in the Moshav, including the local Arab population, has to be on a positive familial basis through labor, the same way the relations between those living in the Moshav are constructed. And as a result, we need to offer, actually it was already decided, that part of the lands that were bought by the Nahalal was then ceded back. And Gordon endorsed this, ceded back to the Arab population who beforehand were absentee landlords. All in all, his respect and his understanding of the positive relations that need to be developed between the peoples was through a substitution of labor for the categorical imperative of labor that replaced, so to speak, Kant's categorical imperative of an ideational morality. Every human being is a human being because he has no choice but to work for his survival through labor. And that's what makes us and the Arab residents of the land brothers, and that's the way we have to treat each other. And he went on to say it's only through this type of development of relations and not through a capitalist or socialist political relations that the relations can be created in a positive way.
Excuse me. Thank you. Lilach, is there anything that you want to add to that?
No, I think that he wasn't very unique in this attitude. I think that many of his period thought the same. Many of his period had the same conflict that Yair mentioned between the national, devote himself to the national revival and to hold the human principles and the equality principle between all human beings. And there was a big dichotomous between the national revival, the national idea, and the socialist idea. And we know that eventually, I think the national idea won. And as other pioneers from his period declared that, okay, establishing the Jewish state was the first step, and then we should create an egalitarian society as a whole, but we're still waiting for this for this level, for this new level.
So I think that's, while we wait and ponder a perfect egalitarian society, I think that is the perfect part to pass that task off to my dear colleague, Professor Yehuda Mirsky, who will.
Perhaps I can mention in this regard just 1 second, because we are a couple of weeks before the election in Israel, and we are now celebrating 100 years of women's rights. We can vote in the election, and Gordon's supported the right of women to vote in the Yishuv in the early 20s, short time before he died, and he suggested Dvorah Neviah, Dvorah the prophetess, to be a model of imitation, and he opposed the Orthodox circles that were against it. So I think that this is, if we think that he was a man of a human being, a man of contradiction, I think that in this declaration he said, I'm totally in the pioneering circles, belong to the pioneer circles, and not to the ultra-Orthodox or the Orthodox sector. Thank you very much.
Excellent. So first of all, we're all going to vote for the Dvorah party, so sign me up. And with that, I am thrilled to pass this along to my dear colleague, Professor Dr. Yehuda Mirsky, who will take us through some questions and answers. Thank you. Yehuda, please unmute yourself.
Great. Okay, thank you, Shayna, and thank you everyone for a remarkably rich discussion, and thank you to all the members of our audience who sent in questions. So in going through the questions that arrived through the chat, well, or for conversing, they essentially fall into 3 categories, and I'll lay them out sort of first in general and then more specifically. One category of questions relates to Gordon's relationship to, frankly, non-Jewish currents of thought. You know, we could say broader, general, Western, and I'll detail that in a moment. Another set of questions relates to Gordon's relationship and understanding to different aspects of Jewish thought and Jewish tradition and practice and so on. And the third set of questions generally is about his place in the history of Zionism, his place in the history of labor movement in general, and religious Zionism and so forth. So if I could detail. So first, the question about Gordon's relationship, influences, comparisons to any number of thinkers. It's been asked about Gordon and Spinoza, right? Which is sort of makes sense, given if you're talking about a philosopher of nature and so on, right? And mentioning only to sort of complicate the question of Spinoza as the first modern Jew or not the first modern Jew, etc. People ask about Gordon and Tolstoy, right? On the one hand, Gordon sounds a lot like Tolstoy. At the same time, we know he had very critical things to say about Tolstoy, as was mentioned last week, and people would want to hear more about that. To what extent do the kinds of things that Gordon is talking about reflect discussions that were going on among Russian social democrats and even early Bolsheviks about the place of religion and revolution? There's a question about what Gordon thought about Darwin, right? And to what extent does he think in terms of civilization and productivity, or is he thinking about these things in different ways? So why don't some of you take a first crack at that before I get to the second round of more obviously Jewish questions? Gordon and Spinoza, Gordon and socialism in general, the socialist theory and practice of his time, religious discussions of religion and labor among Russian social democrats, Darwinism, the whole stew. What do you think? Yossi, do you want to start?
Yeah, I'll say very briefly a few things about similarities and differences with Spinoza and Darwin, and maybe something very general about his relationship to socialism. First of all, very interesting that we can see Gordon as Spinoza's. Gordon is a pantheist, but his pantheism is in very much a form of Spinoza's pantheism turned on its head. For both, all of reality, all of nature is divinity. Divinity and the world, divinity and nature are one and the same, except that Spinoza was a rationalist who imagined all of reality and therefore divinity, nature, through mathematics, through geometry. It's nature is all an idea. Extension represents the objective, concrete aspects of nature, but it's still from the perspective of mind. Whereas for Gordon, nature is creation. Divinity is the process of creation, right? Human beings are a part of that, and so are human beings' minds to an extent. But here it's a very material, not so much material. There is a spiritual and ideational aspect of it, but it's an empirically given substance. It's not something that's conceived a priori by the mind, which brings me to a very interesting comparison between Gordon and Darwin. Because Gordon says explicitly at a certain point, and I have to say, when I came upon this text, I was surprised. I didn't see it anyplace else. But you ask yourself, what, as Yehuda said before, how could Gordon not think of Darwin when he talks about man?
Actually, I do have to say, it wasn't me, it was an astute listener. So, but yeah, an astute member of our audience.
So I strongly commend the astute listener. But Gordon actually says in one place very explicitly that the human being, including human consciousness, was developed through the process of evolution, probably in a certain phase of social conditions that affected, the animal life that came before human beings. He's a clear Darwinist in that sense, that human beings are a product of natural evolution. Except that whereas Darwin continues to see human beings and all of human mind, human civilization in general, as a continuation of that process of natural evolution, for Gordon, the creation of human cognition is, I forgot the word in English, sharuya. What's sharuya in English?
Scandal?
A scandal from the point of view of nature, because human consciousness that was evolved, came out of evolution, separates the human being from the nature that he was born in, and therefore stops the process of evolution, and also totally disrupts the natural mechanisms that the human being needs for survival, development, enrichment, and so forth. That's concerning him and Darwin. Finally, with regard to socialism, and this is, I won't say that much, Gordon is a socialist, and I have to admit, I don't know enough about East European socialists, and won't go into that, but Gordon is a socialist to very similar to the early Marx. Gordon is a socialist whose socialism, by the way, he says he's not a socialist, but he means that he's not a Marxist. He is a socialist to the extent that his entire critique of civilization and the meeting between technology and capitalism and science after the Industrial Revolution, right, leads him to an anti-capitalist attitude. But rather than see the society or the social apparatus place policies in place which will achieve a more ideal society based on human understanding as it works through the class struggle, for Gordon, it goes back to nature. It does nature which precedes society, in saying, once again, as I did before concerning self-fulfillment, that the justice for what I would call the socialist society he's yearning for is more what Marx would call a utopian socialism, the type of society in which the freedom of relations will allow for the self-realization of every individual in each group, rather than there being social apparatus that was called into play in order to
yes, indeed, and an astute listener, another member of the audience, maybe the same one, pointed out that this sounds a lot like young Hegelians and early Marx and so on. Finally, before I let you go on this round, Yossi, and then I want to hear very much from the other panelists, Tolstoy. Right, sometimes people say Gordon is just warmed over Tolstoy, but he says very strongly that he's not Tolstoyan.
Yeah, I'm not enough of a Bucky and Tolstoy to weigh in on it.
Okay. So Lilach, Yair, just your thoughts on sort of Gordon, Lilach, how does Gordon relate to other Zionist socialist thinkers that you know of the time? Obviously, he's not a Marxist like Baruchov. He doesn't believe in class struggle, right? Are there other Jewish socialist thinkers of the time or socialist Zionists to whom he seems comparable to you? Or his social thought?
No, but maybe you can add about his relationship with Rabbi Cook.
Well, yeah, no, I'm afraid everyone, I inflicted a bit of that last time, but actually I was thinking about it a few moments ago when you pointed out his support for female suffrage. Of course, Rabbi Cook disappointed many people by being opposed to female suffrage in the early 1920s.
But they shared a few perceptions, like the Hebrew language and the moral and
True. No, they're similar in many, many ways. Though Yair, I'm wondering, how do you, from your work, right, sort of mining, excavating Gordon as a kind of secular theologian and who sort of diminishes the categories between religious and secular, where do you see him in the fabric of modern thought along this seam, this line between the secular as an idea, right, and secularism, as opposed to secularization as a process, and religious thought? How does he help us think differently about these familiar dichotomies?
I guess I would follow Yossi's line of thought in terms of the differentiation between the rational and the notion of experience that Gordon innovates, right? Gordon, you mentioned this and you talked about it extensively in last week's panel about Gordon's differentiation between reason and experience by innovating the term chavaya, right, in Hebrew, which is a combination of chaim and havaya, or chayut, vitality, life, and being. But I think that what is really interesting about Gordon and how he changes or challenges the modernist approach and the Darwinist approach and Spinoza's approach as well is pointing to the rational aspect of the human being as being both a natural character and a problematic character. This tension within the individual is impossible to overcome. It's impossible to resolve in a way. And I think that Gordon, instead of pushing aside this conflict, instead of pushing aside this contradiction between reason and chavaya, experience, right, he embraces it, and in that, or through that, he relates, or he addresses the modern problem of human existence and grants it a theological baggage, or charges it with a theological meaning. So to me, I think exactly the differentiation between Gordon being a secular or a theologian thinker is crucial here.
But listening to you, it strikes me that one of the things that's interesting here is that Gordon doesn't sort of go the obvious romantic route of celebrating the irrational and celebrating the emotional and so forth. And he's not the only person by any means to sort of take this the problems with rationalism and sort of transform it or sublimate it into a kind of nationalism. But there's something about his nationalism that's very prosaic. Right, his nationalism is sort of less heroic about like national symbols and national myths, and more about taking responsibility for your life with other people and taking responsibility for other people's lives in extremely concrete ways, like how are they going to feed themselves and how are they going to clothe themselves and what are you going to do to help them?
I just want to say to that, on the one hand, as you said, Gordon is like really, he answers to the most fundamental or materialistic even, right, concerns of the actual individual, right, how he would work and eat and so on and so forth. But at the same time, the way that he envisions the national redemption or revival is not through a bureaucratic mechanism, right?
Right.
Not through a state necessarily, right? Not
Right.
through, okay, the mission, the aim, the goal is to establish a state for the Jewish people, and that's it. That's the end of Zionism.
Right.
It's the Zionism coming to fruition. For him, it's an everlasting process of internal, communal, national renewal. And in some ways, his Zionism is far more prophetic or far more messianic, right?
Yes,
Than
utopian.
the Zionist movements, than the Zionist movement's aims, political aims, I should say.
Right. Well, so then this brings me to the second set of questions that we received from the audience. And that's Gordon and aspects of Jewish tradition, right? What aspects of Jewish practice or mitzvot does he seem to most encourage or celebrate? What texts, to the extent to which he thinks people should still be reading Jewish texts, right? What texts ought they to be reading, and how? Did he have a conception? One marvelous question we got. Did he see himself as trying to create a new kind of Judaism? One of our participants in one said, like, was he trying to create like an Aboriginal Judaism, right? Is he sort of like a kind of Canaanism avant la lettre, but very spiritual? Did he think of himself as a Jewish thinker in that way, as doing a new kind of theologian? And, the question we're talking about Rav Kook, but also early on, more questions is if people would like to hear more about, to the extent to which kibbutz hadati, right? And the early founders of Hapoel HaMizrahi, the religious workers movement, were interested in Gordon. You think of Shachal's famous formulation of Hamered HaKadosh, right? The sacred rebellion, that this is Judaism is a rebellion against the gross materiality of this world and bourgeois society and diaspora Judaism, but all in the name of Torah. Is that influenced by Gordon or not? So if you please could address those, and then we'll get to the last set of questions. Who wants to, Yossi or Yair or Lilac, do you want to start off? Yossi, please.
Okay, that's, I think, first of all, a terrific question, because we can only surmise or bring together, again, different aspects of his thought in order to understand what kind of Judaism he envisioned for the future, or what kind of a Judaism was to arise from within his thought. And this is directly related to the question that I preferred not to relate to at the beginning, why he opposed the term religion of labor. One of the central themes of Gordon's thought, it appears almost every place in different ways, using my own language, is his appreciation of what I call the religio-cultural heritage of various peoples, or what we call Judaism within the Jewish people. The religio-cultural heritage of the people is much a part of the nature that the people are born from, that every individual, Jewish individual, is born within Judaism, the way it's carried and experienced in the family, the community, and the people. What's even more important for Gordon is that through this religio-cultural heritage, or for us, through the Jewish texts of the past, the experience of the holidays, and so on and so forth, that we acquire categories, ways of thinking, images, symbols that mediate to us the distant expanses of the cosmos. It's part of our nature in that way. It becomes a part of who we are. Now, I said I'm not much of an expert on Tolstoy, but in Gordon's introduction to his translation, he translated Tolstoy's book on art. He says a fascinating thing about Jewish sources. He says the Bible is the most expansive of all Jewish sources, and it reflects an expansive form of life that the Jews or the Israelites were living at the time of the Bible. He says concerning the Talmud that we don't know. He says, I don't know whether the Talmud is expansive or contracted. It involves a lot, but it's more contracted than the Bible. The Shulchan Aruch is the most contracted, and he's criticizing it, right? Jewish source that we can imagine. And coming out of this, especially when we see a statement in another place on education and talks about Judaism, like why he thinks that we need to still study Judaism today, he's arguing with his younger comrades because we're not a new a new creation that just was created today, but we're part of a creation or an ancient tree that's been developing and growing. And from all this, we understand that Gordon had the expectation that by living and studying the Jewish past, we then through this religio-cultural heritage, we then have the means to create a new phase through reinterpretation, and that will be the rejuvenation of Judaism. So he's
one last quick question for you on this. Do you think Gordon would have been pleased to know that he's taught in Jewish philosophy departments? Would he have been upset about this? Would he be surprised? Would he be, right, that we sort of, we slot him alongside, well, there's Reb Kook and there's Soloveitchik and there's Gordon and there's Heschel and there's this and there's that. Would he be surprised by that?
I think I don't know if he would be surprised or not. The answer to that question is whether he would be surprised to find that he's still relevant. He asked not to be written about or taught if he's no longer relevant. I think for him, what meant to be relevant, and this, if you permit me, is the reason I think, because there's a particular reason why I think that Gordon is very relevant today. But if Gordon was to be asked, what is it that would make him relevant, it's so long as what he has to say about life and the quest for life and the rejuvenation of life, Jewish life and human life, as long as that's still relevant, I'm sure he would be pleased if he thinks he's being taught correctly, of course. Right. Why do I think that this is super important for today? Because when we go back and look in Gordon's own time, the way he critiqued civilization and culture and society in the wake of the Industrial Revolution, he maintained that the Industrial Revolution created new realities based on human cognition that cut us off from nature and cut us off from the sources of our life. I maintain that in the present day, the very same problems to which Gordon was presenting his understanding of labor and man in nature, in addition to the Jewish problems, the problems that came from the Industrial Revolution, the contemporary digital revelation exasperates 100 or 1,000-fold. And to me, that's what makes Gordon's philosophy of man and nature and the return to nature as a basis for the revitalization of human life as totally relevant. I think Gordon would have seen that if he was aware of what's going on today, but you never know.
You never know. So we have about 9 minutes left. So in addition to the questions I put to you about Gordon and sort of Jewish texts and so forth, I would also like to fold in the last set of questions that we've got. An assessment of Gordon's place in the history of Zionism and history of labor Zionism. To what extent did labor Zionism live out aspects of Gordon? To what extent was he a road not taken? And if so, why? And Lilac, Yair, and Yossi, I'd love to hear from you.
I think that Gordon nowadays living among the religious Zionist people and not among the labor movement. In particular among the kibbutz adati that's still quoting it, as I mentioned before, and you can find in the website of the religious kibbutz, the beginning is a quotation from Gordon. So they are using him in the 21st century to explain their ideas. But if I want to relate to your previous questions, and I think that, well, in his youth he was observant, but when he grew up, he only kept some of the traditional commands, the Shabbat, the fast days, the festivals, and he stopped praying and stopped, הפסיק להניח תפילין, and he replaced the prayer books and the tefillin with the hoe. And it was totally different from religious pioneers. They didn't want to replace their religious point of view and the religious way of life with the agricultural, with the settlements. They didn't want to replace, they wanted to combine this word. They thought that they cannot think that the religious way of life would prevent them from being pioneers. So they struggle to find a way that will allow them to be pioneers and religious observant and to establish kibbutzim. And they found, they were very creative, and they found ways to milk cows in Shabbat. And it seems like Gordon gave up. Well, he couldn't combine these two words, so he gave up. I'm not sure because it was difficult to combine, but because he thought maybe it was his ideological decision, but the religious pioneers wanted to combine the words and then didn't replace one word with another. They combined it together.
Yes. And to what extent do you think, and Yair, I'd love to hear what you think also, labor Zionism, which after all called itself labor Zionism, right? To what extent did labor Zionism historically, especially in the decades after Gordon's death, did they understand labor in the way that he understood it? Or, you know, what last week when we were all talking, I said that Gordon at some point became, maybe I'm unfair about that, but I said he seemed to be one of these figures who was sort of more quoted than read, right? Did labor Zionism pursue Gordon's idea of labor or not, or why? What do you all think?
I'll relate to that. I think what you said and what you mentioned last week is pretty accurate. In relation Gordon being, you know, more quoted than actually read, and he was accused of that already, you know, of being not really clear or understood or too theological or too complex or whatever already when, you know, during his lifetime. I think Gordon's thought was not necessarily adopted in the way that he pushed for it, mainly because historically what happened is that in the beginning of the third Aliyah, an ultra socialist on the verge of communist wave of new immigrants are coming to Palestine, and Gordon is terrified. Is terrified about that, and he writes one of his most fundamental essays, you know, a fundamental clarification of our idea, right? And it's a polemic, it's a direct polemic against
all these Marxists.
Kind of thought that is, exactly, this Marxist materialistic line of thought that comes and in a sense takes over the Zionist discourse, or the labor Zionist discourse, I should say. So in a way, Gordon was, you know, he was adopted as long as it served this line of thought. But I don't think it'd be fair to say that he was, you know, fairly adopted. Can I also add one more thing about the theological aspect or something like that about Gordon's relation to Jewish tradition? One of Gordon's last essays is about Yom Kippur. It's one of his last essays, and it's also, you know, him pondering about the possibility of religion or the relevance of religion to life. And he says, what do we have? We, right? What do we? And when he says we, he says, what do we have? The people who are not observant in the traditional sense. We, and he says, and I'll try and quote, you know, as best as I can. We, the generation of knowledge, the generation of thought, the generation of rational thought, right? Do we or don't we have anything deep to say or any deep connection to this day? Davka, right? Just simply because we are not religious in the traditional sense. So I think in a way, what Gordon also towards the end of his life, he also adopts the notion of you know, this generation of not being traditionally observant as actually an opportunity for a different reading of Jewish tradition, or a different connection, a new connection to Judaism or to Jewish tradition, or and then specifically to Yom Kippur. But Gordon talks there about religion in general.
Thank you so much. And with that, Shayna, I'll hand it over to you, but not before thanking Anna once again for making everything run so smoothly. And thank you.
Thank you again. Thank you to the panelists. Thank you to Yehuda. And thank you all, of course, to everyone who participated. I just want to remind you that we will have the final meeting in our 3-part series next week, 1 week from today, The Nature of A.D. Gordon, Environmentalism, Nationalism, and Jewish Culture. There will also be a recording of this event sent out soon to participants. Thank you all again so much. I hope everyone has a lovely day.